In our first video, we introduced the Suez Canal as well as its geography and precursors. In this video, we will be exploring the origin, construction, and early history of the modern Suez Canal. Today, we will be focusing on its construction, which was overseen by the French diplomat, businessman, and engineer Ferdinand de Lesseps, and how it went from one Frenchman's personal project to a vital lifeline of the British Empire at its peak. In the last video, we explained how Napoleon ordered a survey of the land with the plan of building a canal. However, his engineers and surveyors made an error and found that the Red Sea was around 8.5 meters higher than the Mediterranean Sea. This would require the use of locks, significantly increasing costs and construction time. This misconception was not corrected until the 1800s when French explorer and engineer Leon de Bellefonds performed his own survey of the Suez Isthmus. He discovered that the two seas had very similar water levels, meaning the canal would not require locks and therefore be much cheaper. Upon hearing the news, Ferdinand de Lesseps became very interested in the prospect of building a canal in the region. However, Lesseps and the French did not have permission to build in the area from the local authorities. Following the Ottoman reconquest of Egypt, Muhammad Ali Pasha was instated as viceroy of the region. However, he was disinterested, leading to Lesseps convincing one of Ali Pasha's sons, Said Pasha, to go through with the project. Upon Said Pasha becoming the viceroy of Egypt, he granted two concessions which allowed Lesseps to build the canal with some caveats. The first concession was established in 1854, which would lead to the creation of the Suez Canal Company. More importantly, it gave the company permission to run the canal for 99 years after completion. However, 15% of the annual net profits would be given to the Egyptian government, who would also appoint the president of the company. In 1856, the second concession was granted, which clarified some of the articles from the first, but focused on maintaining the neutrality of the canal. The goal was for the canal to be open to anyone, regardless of tensions or war, as a form of freedom of navigation. The Suez Canal Company was officially created in 1858 and immediately began raising funds for the project. The company decided to sell 400,000 shares to foreign investors. Egypt had about 92,000 shares, and some 85,000 shares were reserved for British, American, Austrian, and Russian investors combined. The rest were unreserved and could be purchased by anyone else. Unfortunately, foreign investors refused to purchase their shares. Desperate for funding, Lesseps convinced the Egyptian government to take out a high-interest loan of 28 million francs to purchase the remaining shares. After the purchase, Egypt owned around 177,000 shares of the company with an approximate value of 89 million francs. This formed roughly half of the company's initial capital. Construction of the canal began in early 1859 when workers began the excavation process. The project was estimated to take 6 years, but ultimately it would take 10, with a total of 1.5 million people having worked on the canal. The initial digging was done by workers using pickaxes and baskets to move material. These workers were Egyptian peasants drafted as forced labor and were essentially slaves. Thus, almost the entire canal was driven through sand and alluvium, except in some places where rock could not be avoided. Over the construction period, there were many controversies in regards to the treatment of the Egyptian workers. It is estimated that as many as 120,000 workers died from the poor conditions and even a cholera outbreak. When the British understood the potential value of the canal, they attempted to inspire the workers to revolt against the Suez Canal Company's treatment. The viceroy, Said Pasha, also condemned the use of slaves, and all slave labor ceased, which halted construction for a short period of time. Lesseps then sent a letter to the British government describing how 80,000 Egyptian forced laborers died building a railway under similar conditions. Following official condemnation by the British and the Viceroy, followed by the halting of construction, the Suez Canal Company abandoned the use of slave labor. Paid European laborers were brought in who would use steam and coal-powered machines instead of manual tools. Most important was a process called dredging. Dredging is essentially digging in flooded terrain. First, an area would be selected that was already underwater or would be flooded. Then the dredger would be brought in, a machine capable of digging up wet soil. Finally, the submerged sediment at the bottom would be dug up to increase the depth of the water. This process is cheaper and faster than dry excavation, allowing the canal to be constructed faster. However, despite the modern machinery brought by the Europeans, a majority of the canal had already been dug by the Egyptian forced laborers. By the end of the project, almost 74 million cubic meters of soil had been excavated. Nearly a decade after it began, on August 18, 1869, the project was completed and water from the two oceans met. Finally, the modern Suez Canal had been built. The total cost is estimated to have been as high as 433 million francs, double the initial projected cost. On November 17th, 3 months after its completion, a grand inauguration was held to commemorate the opening of the Suez Canal for operation. The inauguration hosted more than 6,000 guests, with many prominent figures including Empress Eugenie of France, who was the wife of Napoleon III, the British ambassador in Istanbul, Amir Abdelkader El Jazari, Prince Taufig, the Crown Prince of Egypt, Nubar Pasha, Prince Tosun, the son of the late Said Pasha, and many others. For the ceremony, many ships passed through the canal, including the ship L'Aigle, which carried many of the important figures in attendance, and was followed by 77 other ships, with 50 of them being warships. The celebration itself cost a total of 1.5 million Egyptian pounds. In 1870, the canal only allowed one-way passage. Despite that, there were 486 transits that year, moving 440,000 metric tons of goods, a massive amount for the time. Mediterranean countries in Europe in particular benefited from the canal, as they now had a much shorter route to the east than major trade powers like Great Britain or Portugal. 6 years after the canal opened, the Egyptian government and Suez Canal Company had accrued a large amount of debt. Traffic through the canal was less than expected, and the government's solution to their financial situation was selling all their shares of the Suez Canal Company. These shares were quickly bought up by the British and the French. The British purchased 44%, while the French purchased the remaining 56%. As well, the Egyptian government waived their rights to 15% of the company's annual profits and gave it to France. As a result, share prices increased massively from 500 to 3,600 francs each. In 1882, Britain occupied Egypt after the Arabi Revolution and proceeded to seize the company's facilities and halt passage through the canal for a short period of time. This completely disregarded the second concession of Said Pasha of maintaining the neutrality of the canal. Later, in 1885, an international committee met in Paris to ensure the freedom of navigation through the canal at all times. However, they were not able to reach an agreement, and 3 years later, representatives from France, Austria-Hungary, Spain, Britain, Italy, Germany, the Netherlands, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire met in Constantinople in 1888. They arranged an agreement ensuring the freedom of navigation through the canal, declaring it a neutral zone under British protection. The Constantinople Convention also forbade the building of fortifications on the banks of the canal. However, Britain did not sign this convention until 1904, and the Egyptian government did not sign this convention until after World War II. The canal was meant to be neutral and kept open in times of war and peace. Despite this, many warships were denied passage through the canal. Notable among these were Spanish ships being denied passage during the Spanish-American War, and Russian ships from the Baltic Sea on their way to Japan during the Russo-Japanese War. At this point, the Suez Canal we use today has taken shape. Already in its early operation, we can see the route and the power that the canal holds today. Although there is still nearly a century left to cover, the canal is less than 200 years old. The following century highlights its importance on the world stage. In the next video, we will be covering how the canal weathered two of the most destructive wars in human history, World War I and World War II.